It's taken a lifetime to get here, through the light and the dark.
Through the light and the dark, in good times and times less so. Wildly dipping around corners, but mostly straight ahead. With family close, yet walking alone if choice had deserted me. And now that I'm here, I'm left to wonder, it all happened so quickly. Where has all the time gone? It is one of life's questions lying within the store of all of us. It is only a matter of when it is asked.
Jessie Amelia is my grandmother, my mother's mother. Jessie Amelia was one of 8 children, and in her life would love, be loved, and be remembered. If it's possible to gain insight and feeling and mood from stories passed down, then I believe that was achieved with my mother recalling and sharing her memories of her mother, Jessie Amelia. But it was not just the stories, for me. My mother carried herself in a way that mirrored her very depiction of her own mother's grace, selflessness and honesty, although she would never concede that. My mother had placed Jessie Amelia on a pedestal that belonged solely to her. As I watched my mother travel through life, she unwittingly, by her ways, would afford me glimpses of the beauty given to the world by Jessie Amelia, and in every other sense, my mother's stories were always to be the closest I would ever get. And the rest, well, it becomes partly speculative, partly heartfelt, and littered with probables, which is the uncontested result of longing and the opaqueness of time. Jessie's family line flows out of Washpool, a village now more a locale 4.5 miles northwest of Stroud, 6 minutes by car or 45 minutes by horse and sprung cart. In 1863, renowned poet Henry Kendall alludes to Stroud having a quietness in his poem titled Dungog.
Towns, while rattles over ribbon rocks the thunder harsh and dry, and blustering gum and brooding box are threshing at the sky. The sea that breaks and beats and shakes, the caverns howling loud, beyond the midnight mile lakes and half-awakened Stroud. For if I know not of thy deeds...
And the 1869 Almanac describes Stroud as being remarkable for its salubrity. The family name was woven into this area, which sits on the lands of the Wanneroo Nation, by Jessie's great-grandparents, John and Sarah. They arrived in New South Wales in March 1842 from Devon, England. John was contracted as a shepherd and shearer by the Australian Agricultural Company. John and Sarah came with their 7 children and would have a total of 12 children, and later purchased farmland at Washpool at the confluence of 2 creeks, Titcombs Creek and one that would take on their family name. Their eldest child, also named John, with his wife Louisa, Jessie's grandparents, would have 14 children, and around 1864 acquired farmland at Washpool along the Cooroora River, naming the property Claremont. They were large families, with many names repeating many times as each new generation of children were born, ensuring unravelling the past to be a somewhat stumbling endeavour. Jessie's father, William Augustus, is the 4th child and 2nd eldest son of John and Louisa. He was born at Washpool on the family property Claremont. He and Elizabeth were married in Stroud, December 1880. Elizabeth's childhood home was Verdant Vale along Mill Creek, 4 miles from Washpool. Her parents, Thomas and Hannah, arrived in Stroud in 1838. Elizabeth was one of 14 children. William and Elizabeth remained at Washpool, likely residing at Claremont. As it is at Claremont, their own children were born and later their grandchildren, the children of their son, George Stanley. On the 7th of November 1901, William Augustus purchased Lot 5 from the Australian Agricultural Company for £38, 2 shillings. It was 47 acres, 3 rod, 20 perch, traversed by Barnes Creek, sitting off Black Camp Road. Interest is raised in the adjoining Lot 675 as it clearly presents as a fundamental acquisition which would have broadened Claremont, attaching Lot 5 to its western boundary. Jessie's father was a farmer. The Sands Directory of 1903 titles him as a dairyman. One thing is for certain, There are orchards on the property where Jessie grew up. How many trees? Did they trade or barter with the fruit? Maybe. What I can say is that Jessie would tell her own children how, when she was a child, their Christmas presents were fruit from their own orchards. Washpool is on the Coorul River, where it meets Barnes Creek, and gained its name from its purpose. It was first known as the Washpool, being built into and around a natural formation where a dam was constructed. It is here the sheep were washed by hand after being shorn. It was first used in the early 1830s and ceased operation some 20 years later, yet in that time it was a landmark in the district. By 1909, when Jessie was 19 years old, a newspaper article reports its glory has departed, and the Washpool is a Washpool now in name only. The hand sketch is by Conrad Martins, an English artist who accompanied Charles Darwin on the Beagle and later came to Australia, and in 1852 he visited the Coorul Valley working on commission with local landowners to produce many sketches. Jessie was born in January 1890 within a pack of 7 girls and 1 boy, and as many in her family had done before her, took her magical first breath in the farmhouse at Claremont beside the comforting drift of the Coorul River. The band of girls must have proven to be a contending force for their only brother as they were growing up. There was George Stanley, Ethel Lillian, Alice Beatrice, Mary Louisa, Lou, Jessie Amelia, Alma Pearl, Stella Evelyn Augusta, and Sophie Elizabeth. There is little available photographic record of Jessie's childhood, of her growing up, other than one photograph likely taken around a year either side of 1897, with it excluding George Stanley and the youngest Sophie, and on this account Jessie was 7 years old. It would be fair to say, and highly likely to be true, the 8 children helped out around the farm and the house as soon as they were capable. Church played a decided role in their lives, where a common outing for the 7 sisters was to the Stroud Methodist Church on Sunday evenings by means of the sprung cart drawn by Punch the family horse at, apparently, a suitably relaxed pace. The extent of their schooling is not clear, and other than homeschooling, it is likely they attended the public school in Stroud, walking dirt tracks and crossing rivers and creeks, or doubling up on horseback to get there and then back home at the end of the day. It is unlikely their formal education proceeded beyond this. George would prepare for farming, and the girls for home duties. Into their teens, the children were participants in the local events and activities, including lantern slide entertainment at the Tellegary Presbyterian Church, where the sisters performed songs. Ethel accompanied, presumably on piano, and there was the collecting of funds for the local hospital, where Alice and Alma and Louisa were active. And the Stroud Flower Show of May 1909, held in the Methodist Church, where on the committee was Ethel and Alice, with refreshments under the management of Elizabeth, Ethel, Louisa and Jessie. And some years thereafter, Sophie was shown to be a talented milliner. We could expect all the children had a graded proficiency on the piano, but what is beyond doubt was George Stanley's comfortable skills with the accordion, for in years to come, a newspaper article would record his playing of the accordion as being a highlight during the celebration of his daughter Rita's 21st birthday, held at Claremont. Jessie was 13 years old when her father, William Augustus, died at 48 years of age. George Stanley, the eldest, was 21, and Sophie, the youngest, was only 6. It was the 5th of December 1903, 3 years since his father passed, and where his mother, Louisa, would outlive her son by 2 years. An article in the Dungog Chronicle expressed sympathy for the bereaved wife and the young family who are now left without a breadwinner. The electoral roll of 1903 was the first to include the women of the nation and recorded William Augustus as a farmer and Elizabeth of Washpool as domestic duties. The voting age was 21, and so only Jessie's brother George Stanley appears on the electoral roll, being a labourer at Washpool. The 1913 Washpool electoral roll shows both Jessie and her mother Elizabeth as domestic duties. George Stanley is now shown to be a farmer, with his wife Frances as domestic duties. Family accounts are clear in that George Stanley ran the Claremont property after his father's death. A photo of 5 women and a baby on the porch of a home is to hand, but is untitled. Is this the farmhouse at Claremont, with Elizabeth in mourning black, nursing her first grandchild, Claude William, and in the company of some of her daughters and daughter-in-law Frances? It could well be, and if so, this is 1910. My grandfather, John Adolph, Jessie's husband, was born in Coolomont in 1884. He's the second eldest of 12 children. My grandfather was known as Jack. I'll call him John. John left Coolomont heading to Stroud, chasing employment on a bridge construction project, and it's there he met Jessie, and on the 27th of May 1913 they were married at the Tellegary Presbyterian Church. 1 year earlier, in May 1912, John was appearing in the Coolomont courthouse as one of 10 men who pleaded guilty to holding a 2-up school and was handed a £2 fine with 6 shillings for court costs. The Wagga Wagga Express describes there being an extraordinary display of interest in the matter, and the courtroom quickly overcrowded with spectators until not even standing room remained. Jessie and John did not stay in Stroud, as John continued to look for work. Their first child, Ivan John, was born in Musselbrook at Nurse Loder's Orwell Lodge Private Hospital. 44 years later, this same hospital is where I was born. From here, Jessie and John went to Maxville on the Nambucca River. Within the first year at Maxville, Ivan died from gastroenteritis. Jessie and John's time in Maxville, where and how they lived, is unclear. It is literally a void with statements of generality only, such as they first lived at Maxville, then moved to Taree. Their second child, Vera May, was born in Maxville in December 1914, followed by Nita in December 1920, and Eric was born in Stroud, November 1924. The Northern Railway was under construction both north and south of Maxville at the time Jessie and John are said to have been there, with bridge construction of great importance to the endeavour, as was the provision of timber sleepers. It is highly probable John secured work for some period of time on such projects, or worked in the timber mills providing the sleepers or the timber demand more broadly. In early 1919, Spanish flu started to impact Australia, with the story passed down that Jessie became involved in the nursing and caring of sufferers, the sick and dying, and was awarded a certificate or commendation for the work she performed. This aligns with their time in Maxville. There is a further yet unconnected family story that is told. Jessie and John at some time managed a hotel, a pub. Is it true, and if so, where was the pub? There is reason to believe it was Stroud, but could it have been Maxville? Despite the geographic uncertainty colouring this hotel proposition comes the following glorious fragment. John's position was to attend the bar, but on one occasion he was absent, and Jessie took his place. A patron approached the bar and asked, "A scotch, please, missus?" Jessie proceeded to meet the request, nervously presenting the scotch in a beer glass, full to the top. The patron's eyes were said to become like saucers and would for some time thereafter continue to lavish praise on the congeniality of the establishment. Jessie and John moved to Taree, where my mother, Joan Elizabeth, was born in August 1926. My mother was a home birth. Her parents were living on Commerce Street. Barry, the son of Vera, raised in amongst Jessie and John's clutch, was born in Taree in March of 1936. My mother, being only 10 years older than Barry, would always see him as her younger brother. In January 1931, at 47 years of age, Jessie's eldest sister, Ethel Lillian, lost her battle with breast cancer. On the 25th of May 1936, Jessie's mother Elizabeth died. She was 82 years old. The Dungog Chronicle in September 1936 lists the sale of property of Elizabeth's estate. The property is Lot 3A, Section C, in the township of Stroud. House with 4 bedrooms and kitchen, all conveniences, in a good position. This property today is 8 Shore Street, Stroud. There is no reference given to farmland, so no clarity is drawn between the Washpool farm and the Shore Street home. I put forward the suggestion, after William Augustus died, there came a time when Elizabeth found it necessary to leave the farm and move into town. That date is uncertain, but it would be sometime after 1913, given the electoral roll and allowing for a notice in the local paper in May 1913, which records Elizabeth holding the wedding reception for her daughter Stella at her Washpool home. How long Elizabeth possibly resided at Shaw Street, for me, is speculation, as she died in Taree in the Cornwall Street home of her daughter Alice. From 1926 and for the remainder of their days, for Jessie and John, Taree was home. Despite Washpool, Stroud and Tellegary so strongly shaping Jessie's childhood through to her young adult days, it is the stories of and the connection to Taree that I was brought up with. For this is my mother's time, my mother's stories, as a child through to marriage and then with her, leaving for other places. Jessie and John at first lived on Commerce Street, then moving not that far away to 91 Albert Street on the corner of Commerce Street when my mother was a baby. 91 Albert Street, as my mother recalled, must have been a mansion in its era, but pretty run down. It was a weatherboard, twin-gabled house painted in a faded red with a slated roof. From the photographs, it had an imposing street presence, yet despite being run down, my mother would say, "The family never really noticed its state. It was our home and the place where we shared many great times." 91 Albert Street was affectionately called the two-story place. From the early 1920s, John began to suffer from rheumatoid arthritis and his condition was to only progressively worsen. John worked in the Taree sawmill, providing the financial support the family needed, with Jessie taking in occasional boarders to supplement John's wage. But that would change. 1930, and John's condition became such that it required him to stop working at the mill. And with his wage gone, it heralded the start of a new era for both of them and the family, Jessie's boarding houses. The boarding house would now become the sole means of income and feeding the family. Then the Wall Street crash, Black Tuesday, and the Great Depression was on the verge of affecting the entire world, but it was also a time that paralleled my grandfather's ailing self. My mother was 4 years old. So from the platform of a young child, as she grew, my mother watched the workings of life, of family, of struggle, of worth, of patience, of understanding and, importantly, of carrying the load. She would witness her mother's strength, determination, love for all, while witnessing in her father's similar traits, yet there, with him, it was mixed with at times a sternness and a crankiness, a product of the debilitating physical pain he was living with and the anguish he faced of not being able to financially support his family. My mother recalled, "He was crippled so much someone had to put on his socks and boots. I could manage the socks, but lacing the boots and tying the bow, he would always get cranky with me. It always ended in tears. After many times like that, I eventually conquered it. I don't blame him for being so cranky. He was in such pain." John's condition weighed heavily on Jessie as she managed her strife-torn husband, a young family, and a business which their survival depended on. Some might say this was a favourable time to be running a boarding house, as Australian workers were prepared to travel to gain employment, and there was a constant flow of travellers, bank and railway workers seeking accommodation. The two-storey place boasted 6 bedrooms. The kitchen and bathroom were outside, but connected off the dining room. Almost entirely wrapping around the ground floor was a veranda with canvas blinds, and it's here on many occasions the family would sleep in order to provide bedrooms for the maximum number of guests, and there could be up to 20 people staying on any one night. Jessie and John spent many nights sleeping on the veranda. Jessie coaxed a wisteria bush to trail over the trellis which covered the entrance, providing shade and coolness during the summer days, and always encouraged her children and their friends to play in the yard. There was always a yard full of kids and a rope swing on the pepper tree, my mother once said. Jessie would send the children out to collect the mail from Cecil Tiplady, the mounted postman. They'd sit on the front brick fence and excitedly wait for Cecil and his horse to trot along. How we loved that horse, my mother would recall. Come March 1937, there'd be no more mounted postmen. The children helped around the boarding house. Jessie, in her kind, affirmative way, assigned the children tasks, with my mother given the job of ironing handkerchiefs, and there was always up to 6 black flat irons warming on the stove. The children would also be required to cut up newspaper squares for the pit toilets, and to ensure there was always a bucket of fireplace ashes to assist lessening its otherwise undisguisable presence. As the Great Depression waned, the Second World War was waxing, yet austerity remained a constant companion. It was simply changing form. On the 30th of May 1940, John Adolf, Jessie's husband, died. John was 55 years of age. Jessie was 50 years old. My mother was 13, being the same age as Jessie when her father, William Augustus, died. Unlike Jessie, little was relayed about John Adolf other than what I have mentioned, but from what can be pieced together, John Adolf was undoubtedly an honourable and good man. John Adolf, also known as Jack, is my grandfather. Jessie was working tirelessly tending to the boarding house and family affairs, yet the personal effort needed to do so would become more demanding, having lost her husband of 27 years, her sounding board, her confidant, her companion. All her children were still living at home. Jessie was now a single parent and undeniably a businesswoman. The boarding house remained the sole source of income. Life goes on, and it had to, and it did. In 1941, the 2-storey place was marked for demolition. Jessie and the family moved to 124 Pulteney Street, Taree, a more modest-sized home, whilst not possessing the high-ranking street presence of Albert Street. It came with its own identity. A nameplate was fixed to the front veranda above the steps. It read, Chatsworth, and it was sewered. And at that time, there was the towering, shadowy presence of the monkey puzzle trees. Jessie continued running her boarding house at Chatsworth, and again the verandas were used as accommodation. Through the war years, there were further responsibilities for Jessie, like installing blackout blinds to windows and the management of ration tickets. Boarders would present their ration tickets before Jessie could buy supplies and prepare meals. Money was always scarce, my mother said. She was starting high school on the Wednesday, and as late as the Monday before, she was still without a uniform. Jessie went to Peel's department store and asked for credit to purchase the material for the uniform. My mother clearly remembered. They were good people, yet refused Jessie credit. Then she went next door to Yarrett and Sons, and Mr. Yarrett said, Jessie, you can have the whole shop if you need it. And Jessie bought on credit material for the tunic, the blouse, shoes, stockings, pants and hat, and set about making my mother's school uniform so she was ready to start high school. In the moments my mother reflected on these times, she would add enormous dimension just by saying, to this day, I don't know how Mum managed. Jessie found the support of many big-hearted storekeepers, amongst them Harold Milligan, who delivered bread, Anthony Dada Draper, who was described by Jessie as a very kind man, Clem Pryor of SP Stores, and there was Mr. Lukens of the Black Cat Cafe, where Jessie would sometimes send my mother for stores with a rehearsed but truthful line. Mum doesn't have the money today, but she will pay you as soon as she can. And on most occasions, sure enough, a traveller that day would knock on the door of Chatsworth, looking for a room and a bed, and there would be cash for Jessie to pay Mr. Lukens. And there were Storm Jewellers, who would play a role later. They had a display window, and it was said the Taree High School girls, when walking home, would stop and look in the window, eyeing the engagement rings and the prices. An expensive world it seemed, and out of reach, or at best to be placed in the hands of destiny. At Christmas time, after the boarders had finished their meal and given their thanks, the family would then gather to have their own Christmas dinner, and Jessie would ensure the remaining plum pudding would still be carrying a sixpence or two for her children to discover and delight over. My mother fondly remembered the excitement of finding a sixpence and how it shone so brightly amongst the pudding and the custard, and then looking up to see Jessie smile and receive her congratulations. In 1941, my mother graduated Taree High School, receiving the intermediate certificate. She was only 14 years old. Jessie accompanied my mother around all the Taree banks seeking an interview for employment, but there was no luck there. Jessie visited Reed's furniture store and secured a job for my mother, and she worked there at Reed's for 3 years. When my mother's sister enlisted in the armed services and left home, she quit her job at Reed's to help Jessie run Chatsworth. It was one thing for Jessie's being to secure the understanding and compassion of the town's storekeepers. The true comfort came from neighbours, family friends, Jessie's children, and vibrantly from Jessie's sisters, where at one point 5 of them were all living close by in Taree. These were the aunties. They were the whirlwind of love and laughter and support for each other, and it was not only my mother who lived out her life, never forgetting the individual and collective beauty of these ladies, but her brother and sisters, and the cousins as well. All the children of the aunties shared this memory. The aunties gathering each Saturday at one of their houses, telling stories, unafraid to laugh at themselves. Their laughter always towered above their hardships. The aunties were short of money, but rich in humour, very close, very caring. My mother passed on the stories of the aunties, how it was this glorious, indelible time in her life when Jessie and her sisters all got together. The aunties, they'd gather in the kitchen at the boarding house, in some way gaining this presence and momentum of a single entity, and their laughter would collect, and as its mass achieved sufficiency, it generously rolled out of the kitchen and down the halls, sharing a comfort to all who were present. I can imagine my mother as a young girl or a teenager leaning against the door frame into the kitchen, observing, absorbing and smiling, and then laughing along with every little movement, every mannerism, every tiny connection she spied between Jessie and her sisters. Where nicknames can be a part of life for some, along the journey I came across the inference that Jessie's sisters called her Mealy. I never got to ask my mother about this. Jessie's life running Chatsworth, even with the support of her children, and even allowing for the trapeze net that was the love and laughter and company of her sisters, was enveloping, never-ending, and unquestionably exhausting. There were times when Jessie's exhaustion would be clearly displayed. My mother and Jessie would go to the pictures together, and just as likely as not, Jessie would fall asleep during the screening, with my mother having the privilege of retelling the story to Jessie as they walked home. "So you enjoyed it, dear?" "Yes, Mum, I did. I'm really pleased we went." Another story came from a visit to Chatsworth by the church minister. The minister's son had stayed the previous night at Chatsworth and had yet to pay his tariff. Sophie was present, and as the conversation bounced between the 3 of them, Jessie fell asleep right at the moment the minister insisted, "Jessie, as I'm here, I'd like to reimburse you." The story goes, Jessie sprung to life, went to her room, immediately returned, handing the minister her Bible, who accepts it with some confusion etched onto his face. Sophie leaned across to her sister. "Jessie, the minister said he'd like to reimburse you, not read a verse to you." You can just imagine the laughter that rang out as the circumstance clarified itself to the 3 participants. Just imagine Sophie and Jessie retelling that story to the other sisters, the aunties, the next time they gathered in the kitchen at Chatsworth, and as they entered a state of helplessness under the commanding humour of the tale, their laughter would be rolling around the house again, drawing my mother to leave what she was doing, walk to the kitchen, to lean against the doorframe, to look in upon the party of wonderful souls and start laughing herself without invitation. Whatever happens in Taree to break up the rigours of life, to provide a diversion, other than the picture show, well, maybe every town on an imposing river like the Manning deserves a flying boat service. In August 1950, Taree received this excitement. with what the paper describes as a great deal of interest, as the Port Macquarie Clipper Company began a weekly flying boat service between Rose Bay, Sydney and Taree, then on to Port Macquarie. The paper reported, "This was the first time many local people had seen a flying boat at close quarters, and all were impressed with its graceful lines and apparent roominess." As the flying boat was moored near the end of Pulteney Street, it is safe to propose Jessie and her family and the aunties all walked down to see it for themselves. It would have been like the carnival coming to town. Within a handful of years the service came to an end, but for that time the unmistakable hum of the engines of the Sunderland arriving and departing on the Manning was a welcome diversion. Around this time my father, working with the New South Wales Railways, was posted to Taree. It would be recommended to him that he tried Chatsworth for a good home-cooked meal, a cake every day, and a safe and friendly place to stay until he found his feet, or maybe longer. And so it happened. My mother and father were on their way to becoming that. My grandmother, Jessie Amelia, died on the 14th of February 1952. Jessie was 62 years of age. After giving so much, I offer. She was essentially worn by the years. The townsfolk would recite, she was possessed of a kind, gentle nature and had a great sense of humour that endeared her to all who knew her. Jessie was a member of the Ladies' Church Aid, the members of which formed a guard of honour at her funeral service at the Taree Methodist Church on that Saturday afternoon. The aunties would no longer be that collective entrenched vessel of laughter in the kitchen at Chatsworth, but the existence of those times are known and remembered by many who were there and who would go on to tell the story. In July 1982, Jessie's younger sister Stella Evelyn Augusta died at 89 years of age. She was the last. In the first week of June 1952, my mother and father announced their engagement, and in October of 52, they were married in Taree. Jessie Amelia would not live to know of their marriage, but surely had a good and comforting feeling her daughter was safe and happy, and to bear that out, their marriage would continue for 63 years when my father died. And as it happened, my mother bought her engagement ring from Storm Jewellers of Taree. Jessie was a widely respected and loved woman, and for me, her presence has not faded. She gave everything for her children, grandchildren, and her family, and fought hard and unwaveringly for 12 years after John's death and for the 10 years immediately before as he was ailing. To hear her story is to feel her strength and the love she gave to others. My mother, when referring to Jessie Amelia, would say with a steely conviction that would never shift, she was just a good person. And Jessie Amelia, such a beautiful name, the name of my grandmother and of a remarkable woman.
Gentlemen, a show of hands if you please.
write a song about anything, and I'll sing it to you someday. We can always say we don't have forever. So what we give, we leave is everything. I'll see you again someday. The morning light lays upon the river. The black ribbon welcomes the warmth and the colour. There's promise in the day. The sun, the earth, the water has washed up against these fields for as long as stories have been told. And where are you? Oh yeah, I see, playing around the house, your sisters and George Stanley. Home, it will always be. I'm not coming round today. Think I'll just stay here and write a song about anything, and I'll sing it to you someday. Yeah, I'll sing it to you someday. I'll sing it to you.